afternoon, everybody. Hello, hello. If I can have your attention, can everybody hear me okay? Fabulous, excellent. So hi everybody and welcome, a very warm welcome. I know we're a small select group, but a very warm welcome to our event this afternoon, which is going to be a deep dive into some of OSCR's inquiry casework. I think we've got an absolutely fantastic programme planned for you to give you a really good insight into how OSCR functions and the choices that we sometimes need to make. So my name is Jess Wade, and I've been a member of the OSCR board since 2016, and I'm also a member of OSCR's Casework Committee. So the committee oversees our main casework activity and provides assurance to the main board, and we tend to see significant novel cases and also to oversee the flow of casework through OSCR. So today we have on our panel the fantastic Martin Tyson, who is Head of Regulation and Improvement at OSCR, and the absolutely wonderful Laura Anderson, who's the Senior Manager for, what does that say? Higher Risk Cases and Quality Assurance. There we go. So they will be sharing with you the huge expertise, but hopefully we're also going to get some input back from you guys as well. So Martin and Laura are going to take us through a series of cases that will best illustrate the range of situations and issues that we deal with on a regular basis, and really just kind of give you a flavour of how we approach individual cases and how it can be very different depending on the information that we're getting in and how we need to respond to that, of course. As I say, we should have hopefully an opportunity for you guys to have some discussion, some conversation, and share with us your ideas and thoughts on how we're doing things and how we might think about things for the future as well. So I know we are a small group, but I think that will make it hopefully a much more interactive session. And as I say, hopefully it will be a really good programme for you this afternoon. So I shall just hand over to Laura. Thank you very much.
Okay, very good afternoon everyone. You can hear me okay? Yes, good stuff. Now, I was reminded at the outset when I was speaking to my good friend Shirley there that if Shirley nods encouragingly, then I know I'm on the right track. However, if there's a kind of a glum look in Shirley's eyes, I'm going to know that I'm kind of going off piste a little bit. So I'm going to try and keep that smile on your face this afternoon, Shirley. So, really good afternoon everyone. Let me see if these slides are going to now work. Yes, they do indeed. Here we are. So, in this session, what we're going to do is we're going to start off by talking a little bit about how we undertake inquiry work. I think it's quite kind of shrouded in kind of myth, kind of suspicion by some people. We're going to try and kind of take all that away. I'm going to talk a little bit about the powers that we have and the general approach that we take to our inquiry casework. From there, Martin and I are then going to move on to talk about some of the specific cases that we've dealt with probably about over the last 10 years or so. We're going to start with looking at one that was particularly high risk, and then we're going to kind of look at the opposite end of that spectrum, the lower risk ones. And in amongst all of that, we're kind of going to touch on some good governance messages and kind of wider learning lessons that we can take from those case studies as well. So let's get started. No, I'm going the wrong way again. It's counterintuitive the way this mouse goes. There we go. So, as the charity regulator, it will be of no surprise to any of you that OSCR has obviously legal powers to undertake inquiries into charities. It's kind of part of the bread and butter as to what we do. Now, those inquiries can either be for general purposes or very specific purposes. That's something which is specified in the legislation that we work under. A specific purpose, to give you a bit of an example, might be when we identify a certain issue that we need to look into in a particular charity. A general purpose might be when we want to undertake a broader review into a charity for some specific reason. But our powers of inquiry also extend a bit further than just charities, and that's again something that I don't think is particularly well understood. So, for example, we also have powers to make inquiries into bodies that are controlled by a charity. So that could be a trading subsidiary, for example, of a charity. Equally, we've got powers to make inquiries into an organisation or a person that's representing themselves as a charity. Now, that's something, again, probably isn't well understood. Now, this is really important because organisations in Scotland can only call themselves and refer to themselves as a charity when they're entered onto the Scottish Charity Register. And there's about 25,000 organisations that are on the register at the moment. If you refer to yourselves as a charity when you're not on the register, That's referred to as what we call misrepresentation, and that's something that, as I say, we've got powers to make inquiries over. And I think particularly that's very important in the context of public trust in charities. But as a public body, of course, we are under some really key duties as to how we carry out our work, and our investigation is obviously no exception to that. So there are a number of kind of regulatory principles that we have to act in line with in all of the work that we undertake. And I've highlighted on the slide there just 3 of the ones I think are particularly relevant in terms of our inquiry activity. The first is that we have to be proportionate in our actions. That means that we need to act in a way that's suitable and appropriate in the circumstances that are presented to us and the circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that, for example, means we can't overreact to a situation. That's particularly relevant in terms of some of the cases that Martin's going to talk to about in a wee while. Secondly, we have to act consistently. Now that means, for instance, that we have to act in line with the published policies and guidance that we have on our website. Thirdly, we have to be targeted in the actions that we take. And there's an overlap there, of course, with the need for us to be proportionate in how we behave. That means we need to focus our energies where they are most needed, not spread ourselves too thin. But when we're making inquiries into a charity, more often than not, the key thing to bear in mind is that we are looking at the actions and the decisions of the charity trustees. They are the people in management and control of the charity, after all. And that's regardless of the name that they give themselves. Again, that's quite a key thing to remember. Quite often, we come across charities that say, oh, we don't have any trustees. Okay, so who runs your charity? Or we have a management committee. They're your charity trustees. It doesn't matter what they call themselves individually, collectively. They are the people in management and control. And there are certain legal duties that all charity trustees have to meet in their running of the charity. And a failure to act in line with those duties amounts in law to misconduct in the administration of the charity. So very often when things go wrong or there are concerns about a charity, it comes back for us as to what the charity trustees have actually been doing. As you would expect also, there are a number of powers that we have to help us do our job when we're making inquiries into charities. Now, the one that we use probably most frequently from those formal powers is the power to obtain information from any person to support our inquiry work. But we've also got powers that we use when we're in relatively early stages of an inquiry, where, for example, we can direct a charity not to undertake certain activities for a period of up to 6 months. Now, that can sometimes be used to help us protect the assets that the charity has and also protect its beneficiaries potentially. When our inquiries are a bit more advanced and we've gathered more evidence, for example, there are other powers that sometimes come into play as well that we can use. Now, there are 2 tests that exist for when we're able to use some of those powers. So it can be either necessary to act for the purposes of dealing with misconduct, so charity trustees have failed in their legal duties somehow, or to protect the assets of the charity, to ensure that they're used for the purposes of the charity. And when we talk about the assets of the charity there, it's probably important to bear in mind that we also include the charity's reputation in that definition. That can be a really key asset that the charity has. So where we can fulfil either of those tests in the course of our inquiry and the power would be necessary and proportionate to use, then we can proceed to use that power. So the power carries with it a right to review, so it's a fairly exercised power, as indeed many of OSCR's formal decisions carry that power. So examples of these types of powers could include, for example, the power to suspend a charity trustee for up to 6 months, the power to freeze a charity's bank account for, again, the same period of time, and also the power to prevent the charity from doing certain things or undertaking certain activities, again, for a period of up to 6 months. But the law also gives us powers to instigate more permanent measures as well. To exercise those powers, we have to apply to the Court of Session for that. And that brings me quite neatly onto the first case in a moment that I'm going to talk about. But before I do that, I'm going to just move on just a little bit to talk about the nuts and bolts of what we do when we first sometimes receive a concern about a charity. Just talking a little bit more about the process, because again, I don't think this is particularly well understood. In fact, in 21-22, the business year 21-22, of the 545 concerns that we received about charities, only just over half of those were considered to be not appropriate for OSCR to deal with. So that means that they were either about issues that are not for us as a charity regulator to deal with. There might have been issues about an organisation that wasn't a charity at all and actually wasn't misrepresenting itself as a charity, or it might have been about an issue that for us as a regulator is not a matter to deal with. It's for maybe for another regulator or another public body to deal with. So when we receive a concern, we subject it to a process of risk assessment, a kind of form of triage, if you will. And that's to help us understand a bit about what we have in the context of other information, for example, that we potentially hold about that charity. And that process allows us to identify quite clearly if the concern is for us or it isn't. So it might be more appropriate for somebody else, for example. If it's a housing association, it might be more appropriate for the Scottish Housing Regulator to deal with. Or it might be that the matter of concern, as I say, is something that for us it's not a regulatory matter, but it's something for the charity trustees themselves to deal with. And we're going to look again at some of those examples later on. So the risk assessment process is designed to really help us understand whether the issues that are presented to us align with matters that are on our organisational risk framework. And we're going to talk about the risk framework at the tail end of our presentation today. We've published the risk framework on our website, and it was updated about 3 or 4 years ago from the original version. But the risk assessment, therefore, that we undertake starts by looking at whether any of the issues that are presented to us in the concern are fit into any of those risk areas. And as part of that process, we also look at other information that we hold about the charity and other information that potentially is in the public domain. So, for example, is there information on the charity's website or its social media account that might help us to understand a bit more about what's actually happening at this time. So at this point in the proceedings, we're trying to get a broad overview of the situation that the charity is in and potentially how serious the matter is that's been brought to us as a matter of concern. Once we've determined that the case is one that we need to take forward, it's assessed as low, medium or high, and that helps us to allocate which of our teams it's going to be progressed by. So let's move on to look at the first case study. So I mentioned earlier that I'm going to start off by talking about one of the kind of higher risk cases that we've dealt with in recent years. Now, although this case started some 10 years ago, it is not a case that is entirely closed at the moment, and the reasons for that will become quite clear as I kind of explain to you what we've been dealing with here. So the information that we first got about this charity in 2012 suggested that kind of all was not as it really should be with the running of this organisation. The allegations primarily related to the actions of one charity trustee in particular, and it suggested that considerable assets of the charity were at risk. So to explain a bit more about some of the detail that we had. The main asset that the Dr. Robert Malcolm Trust held was shares in a company that made investments. It was an investment company. The way that that relationship should have worked, at least in theory, is that the charity would benefit from the activities of the investment company, and it would receive funds from that investment company that it could use for its charitable activities. But the information we received suggested that quite substantial funds, if I remember rightly, it was over £400,000 at this time, had been removed from that investment company and placed into a personal account in the name of one of the charity trustees. Those funds had subsequently been used to purchase some shares. The proceeds of the investment in those shares, that is the money that was received once they were then sold on, was not passed back to the investment company, however, and indeed it continued to be held in the name of that charity trustee and his wife. The charity at that time had 3 trustees. In addition to the trustee that had removed the funds from the investment company and put it into his own and his wife's name, the other 2 trustees were his children. So in effect, the first trustee was nearly running the charity on his own, and the other 2 were there in name only. And I do recall actually being asked why he'd appointed his children in the course of the inquiry. And the first trustee commented that his experience had been it was quite difficult to find good quality trustees. That's why he'd appointed his children. And I think, as we'll go on to see, the quality of trusteeship here was really not as we would wish. So the investment company had also made some interest-free loans to members of the family concerned. And there were monies also paid to the wife of the first trustee for administration services and bookkeeping services, which was in clear contravention of any rules about trustee remuneration. There were also numerous examples of other inappropriate transactions that had taken place involving the first trustee, members of his family, the charity and the investment company. None of those transactions had any formal agreements in place to explain how monies would be repaid to the charity or the investment company, and the charity certainly hadn't benefited in any shape or form from any of these arrangements. So you're starting to get a picture of a pretty poorly run organisation here. So it will come as no great surprise then that as we gathered more and more information quite early on in this inquiry, it really appeared that there had been criminal behaviour here. Now, where OSCR identifies criminal behaviour or suspects that criminal behaviour has occurred, we report that to the Crown Office and Procurator Fiscal Service under the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding that we have with them. And from there, the Crown Office will make an assessment about whether to refer that for police investigation or not. And they do that on the basis of the submission that we make to them. So generally, the submission that we make to them is quite a detailed report with a number of pieces of key evidence that we've gathered so far. So this case proceeded in exactly that way, and by just in a flash, the police were very soon undertaking inquiry work of their own. And throughout the life of the case, we worked through with the police to provide information and insight into what had been going on and what we'd identified already. But there were some quite interesting things that emerged as the police investigation kind of proceeded as well. And some of these really will make your hair stand on end, I have to say. So interesting, probably in the context of the lifestyle that this family were kind of living. Now, their residence was a castle, for starters. Indeed, it is the castle on the left there. And I would say that there must have been plenty of room for kind of any guests, shall we say. And indeed, that castle is now being used as a bed and breakfast, not as part of the charity, I will hasten to add. Other noteworthy purchases that were identified, not one but two Range Rovers, not necessarily the one in the picture there, and a particularly smart Alfa Romeo, again, not the one in the picture there. But there were also some really fascinating property transactions that came to light, including one that one of the charity and the first trustee's children, who again was a charity trustee herself, resided in and ran her business from. So, you're dying to know what happened next. I'm delighted to tell you that there was a very successful prosecution in this case, a prosecution of the first trustee. And that resulted in very substantial amounts of funds being paid back to the charity as a result. And those funds that were calculated to be paid back to the charity took into account the entirety of the benefit that he and his family had received from what had been going on here. So it was a very, very substantial amount of money. And indeed, partly why the case took so long is because they had to sell the castle that we saw earlier, which is now being run as a separate bed and breakfast business, and that took some time, as you can imagine. But there were also actions raised in respect of the other trustees as well, and I think that this illustrates quite nicely that you can never just be a charity trustee in name only. That kind of concept does not exist. But in terms of actions for OSCR to take, I think in the context of protecting the charity, and of course later on the considerable funds that it then would receive back, we petitioned the Court of Session for the appointment of what's called a judicial factor. You'll remember I talked earlier about kind of more permanent measures being available to us when we applied to the Court of Session. That's exactly what we did here. Now, a judicial factor is a professional person who is appointed by the Court of Session to take over the running of the charity, essentially. Their appointment really cuts across any charity trustee who might still be in place, but ordinarily the appointment of a judicial factor is coupled with the removal of any charity trustee who still sits there. At the current time, the judicial factor is still in place in this charity. That's why I mentioned earlier this case is not yet closed. That obviously is partly because it has taken some time to liquidate the assets of the trustee in order to allow him to pay back what he was actually due under the criminal investigation and the compensation and confiscation orders that were put in place. But it's very clear to see that the future of that charity will be much brighter with very substantial assets coming back to him, but of course it will have a new board of charity trustees in time. So what does all this tell us? What can we take from this? I think I think for me, there are a number of things that it's really appropriate for me to highlight in terms of what this means about OSCR's work. The first, and this might sound a bit obvious, but the first issue is that where significant and really serious things actually happen in a charity, we will make inquiries. You can absolutely bet on that. That's very much part of the bread and butter as to what we're expected to do in the way we work as a regulator. The second is that where there are allegations of criminal behaviour, we will always report that to the relevant authorities. Now, be that the Crown Office, be that to HMRC, depending on what the issue is. And that is to allow that matter to be dealt with appropriately by the people with the correct authority and the correct powers to do so. Often we will support the police with a criminal inquiry through the provision of statements and the provision of evidence. That's the normal course of business for us. But the key, I guess, takeaway point from this is that serious failings in a charity will have really serious consequences. And there is actually no getting away from that, and neither should there be. Because running a charity and being responsible for charitable assets, being in a position of trust, it's not something to be taken lightly. It is a very serious job. And so good governance in the running of a charity is absolutely paramount. Doing that job of running the organisation appropriately, in line with the relevant rules, is critical. No charity trustee can afford to be complacent in what they're doing or to take that role lightly. Now, the kind of governance, I guess, lessons from here are very much what our Chief Executive, Maureen, would call motherhood and apple pie, if you like. They're not ones that you're going to find surprising, but they are good solid points that every single charity trustee needs to have kind of front and centre, I think, in their minds when they're undertaking that role. And obviously, as we set out here, they are quite clear. Charity assets are obviously the means by which the charity is able to deliver on its activities and its purposes. They are assets that are there to help the beneficiaries of the charity. As such, they must not be used for any other purpose other than what the charity was set up to do. Secondly, of course, the trustees are the people who are responsible for the stewardship of the charity's funds. It is a really critical role that they undertake. It's a position of trust that they hold, and that role has to be honoured and protected. It's not only for the good of that individual charity, but I would say also in terms of public trust and confidence in charities and the charity sector at large. But finally, I would say also the importance of keeping really good, clear accounting records came through very, very strongly in this case. There are legal requirements that set out how a charity must keep accounting records that show day to day how money has been received and spent in line with its purposes. And in this case, that was of course not the reality. There was a clear lack of transparency as to how the funds were actively being used, and that's really what made this case unravel in the end. So that's given you kind of a bit of a taste, hopefully, for what we deal with at the really high risk end of the scale. Now I'm going to hand over to Martin, so that Martin can talk to us a little bit more about what casework looks like kind of overall and talk about some specific examples of lower risk cases. I'm going to try and move this slide on for you. There we go.
Great. Thanks, Laura. And hopefully I can find the right button. That's not always a strength of mine. So, coming back to some of the points that Laura was talking about there, and I think particularly that set of principles about how we go about our work. So what the law says is we need to do what we do, bearing in mind certain regulatory principles. Key ones being consistent, being targeted, and being proportionate. So just thinking about what being targeted looks like. For this bit of what we do, being targeted is about making choices about what we do, where we put our resources, and what we spend our time on. And I'd just like to go back a little bit to that point about risk assessment and what we do with information that comes into us. We get a lot of information about charities. A lot of it comes in from members of the public. Sometimes it comes in from charity trustees about their own charity or about other charity trustees. We hear from employees. We hear from other regulators. We obviously get or we see media reports. We also hear from people like independent examiners and auditors as part of their duties. And we hear from charities themselves sometimes. And we risk assess that income and information about charities. And as Laura said, quite a chunk of those will be stuff that we could never take action on. It's not for us, it's not about charities, it's for another regulator or another body to look at. That's not amazing, actually, and that's something I'm wanting to change, because what that really means is, a whole chunk of people who've written to us are going to feel like they've wasted their time, and that's not okay. So there's a few things we need to do about that. 34% of what comes in as what we regard as low risk, and that is where there is something there that comes within the scope of our regulation of trustees and their duties. It's not particularly acute. We don't think there are assets at risk. We don't think there are beneficiaries at risk, but we are concerned enough that we want to engage with the charity. And I'm going to talk really, the substance of what I'm going to say is about what that engagement means. 13% of them are medium risk. That's where we are starting to have a level of concern about assets, about beneficiaries, or about the reputation of the sector, really sort of quite substantive things that we're concerned about. 4% come out as high risk, and that's really high priority stuff. We have along the lines of the case that Laura was talking about, we have a sense of, if you like, a clear and present danger to charitable assets or to the beneficiaries, or something that is going to have a really severe impact on the charity or the sector that falls within those issues around charity trustee duties. So that's about us exercising our choice. That's about us being targeted, and that's what the outcomes are like. Those regulatory principles mean that if we focus on that lower risk band, that 34%, the work we do in response to those looks and feels a lot different for us and for the charity concerned, because what happens is that other principle of being proportionate kicks in. There's a legal definition of being proportionate, which I can't remember word for word, but it is about suiting the means to the end. If you have a particular legitimate aim that you are wanting to do, in this case, if there is a risk that you're going to address, the weapons, the means that you use to address that need to be just enough. They need to be right. You can't use a sledgehammer to crack a nut. You can't use some of the very sort of high-end regulatory tools that Laura talked about in that earlier case of getting the court to appoint a judicial factor or suspending trustees. We're not in that realm. It would be wrong for us to be taking that kind of action, and that's the kind of action that would cause people rightly to challenge what we did. So we need to get into this a little bit differently. The work we do with these kind of cases is often quite light touch, but it is valuable. It is the right thing for the case, and I want to talk about how that happens. A lot of the time, the job isn't about taking action to prevent things. It isn't about addressing those high-end risks. It's about cases where a charity is starting to go awry. It's starting to go off the rails in ways that we think are important, and it's about supporting the charity trustees in their role. And that can look like a number of different things according to the situation. And maybe let's go on to the case studies and talk about what that looks like. So the first one, we got concerns about a charity in the health sector. This is from a very much ex-employee. She had a number of concerns. it was a background of a number of grievances occurring in the charity, the cost of the investigations into those grievances, some of the recruitment that had happened after that, and whether that recruitment had been fair. Now, some of what was in what was concerning the person who wrote to us wasn't necessarily what was of concern to us. That was, if you like, that was what mattered to them. And this is quite often the case. We will receive information and there will be something that matters to the person that sent it. When we look at it, actually it's something else that matters to us. It will be a symptom of a different problem as far as we're concerned. And that's what part of the art of it, as far as we're concerned, is to work out what it is that's relevant for us, what it is that's a priority for us, and what we should focus on. It's not our business to second guess trustee decisions on who to hire, who to fire. It's not our business to second guess issues that either will or won't go to an employment tribunal. But what concerned us when we looked at the overall picture here was a pattern of things happened over a number of years that made us wonder whether there was sufficient oversight and control of the charity by the trustees to have this sort of pattern of issues happening. So we had a reasonably sustained engagement with the trustees, talking about what had happened here, getting quite detailed evidence from them of what action they had taken. And we went to and fro a few times, going into detail on particular things. And what emerged there was that there had been a sort of pattern of issues within the charity, but that the charity trustees had, after a time, taken hold of the situation. They had taken expert external advice that was appropriate. It had cost the charity a fair bit because by then the problems that they were having to deal with were pretty complex. But it had identified the problems and allowed them to address the problems. They explained to us how they'd gone about the recruitments that resulted from a lot of this, and we were satisfied that they'd exercised their duties of care and diligence in doing that. And the evidence was that the charity was now, after a number of years, in a better place. We had some sort of pointers to give them, and that was, I think, about the level of control and oversight over staff to try and prevent this happening again. But overall, we were satisfied, we were reassured that the risk that there had been in that charity had been mitigated. And that's not an untypical sort of pattern for us. There will be a lot of cases. I should say, the three that I'm dealing with here, basically what I did is went to one of our caseworkers and said, just give me your last 3 closed cases. And this is pretty much what we're looking at. Second one I'm looking at, it's a community charity. Again, an employment dispute. We get a lot of incoming concerns that concern employment. But again, it's not the actual detail of the dispute. It was what was coming out of that in terms of trustees' relationship with the senior staff in the charity. And bluntly, the question that raised in our mind was, who is in control of this charity? Is it the charity trustees, or is it a couple of very long-standing members of staff? Falling from that, as trustees, do the trustees know what's happening to the money in this charity? Are they getting the information through the members of staff that they need to run the charity? We were really not sure about that. The interesting one here is this came to us from the charity trustees, and they were essentially at their wits' end, saying, we don't know what to do about this. They kind of knew they needed to tackle it, but they were reluctant to do what they needed to do to tackle it, and that was to go out and get the kind of, frankly, quite hard-edged employment law advice that they were going to need to deal with the problem. And I think they felt that they were likely to be challenged by the very members of staff that they were having the problems with if they were going to spend that money. They didn't, almost the balance of power in the charity had gone the wrong way there. And I think what we were able to do there is engage with them, and it was a little bit of sort of, I don't know what you would call sort of good cop, bad cop. Because first of all, what we had to say is, well, look, this is your job. This is the charity that's been entrusted to you. You need to be in charge. These are decisions for you. We understand that this is difficult. You need to get someone on side who can give you the advice that you need. And we understand the reluctance and the pressure on you not to spend the charity's money in ways that are considered to be unnecessary. Actually, in this case, it is necessary. And we tried to sort of clarify where they were for them. And I'm glad to say that they have taken the appropriate advice and they are now moving on. So that's probably a little bit more light touch than the last one was, but it's almost about providing a bit of reinforcement to the charity trustees as to, look, this is your thing, and you get to do it, and you have a duty to do it. And the last one is probably the simplest one, actually. We had a concern about recruitment criteria that were being used by a charity that's a food bank. Basically, they were recruiting or looking to recruit someone who was really in a backroom role, sorting out the stuff that went into the food bank. Sorting the stuff into the bags to go out to people, making sure they had enough stock. And the criteria that were being used included a requirement that they had certain religious beliefs. And that was being questioned by some of the people who had applied for jobs. And we looked at that, and it wasn't clear to us why they thought these were relevant criteria for the job. And there was starting to be a little bit of publicity about that and a bit of impact on the charity. We simply went back to the charity and said, what is it you have in mind here? Why is it that the criteria that you are applying here are relevant to these posts? Do you know that there is some relevant law around this? Have you thought about it? Actually, they came back, thought about it, and said, no, hands up. We have now re-advertised the post in the right way. So it's a very light touch there. It is sort of 1-2 emails, and we're able to move the charity on.